Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak to, as the final Labour Speaker in this first reading of the Arts Council of New Zealand Toi Aotearoa Bill, and if, as the previous speaker described, this bill is death to process, then it is also possibly death to regional funding for the arts and in some of our important provincial centres and other communities. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Steve Chadwick for her work in the area of arts, culture and heritage, and Chris Finlayson for his work on this bill. And the Labour Party, as you've heard, will be supporting this bill to Select Committee with some reservations. We have some genuine concerns, as you've heard, and where we will get the opportunity to put Creative New Zealand under the microscope. Labour welcomes any changes to efficiency, but we're asking whether this structural change is necessary and whether it will be enough, and we do have some genuine concerns that I do want to outline. This bill is an example of streamlining, downsizing to the possible detriment of fair representation and Kiwi creativity, despite what the previous speaker said. The bill replaces the Council and two arts boards with a single board, the Arts Council of New Zealand, Toi Aotearoa, and this lone board will be responsible for determining strategic direction, priorities and a policy framework for the whole organisation and for funding allocation decisions. And the new structure will supposedly improve the Arts Council efficiency and responsiveness and ensure that the best investment of resources for the benefit of New Zealand artists, arts organisations and all New Zealanders. But we've got concerns about the representation of the committee, and it's estimated that this bill will reduce the number of board members from 28 to 13. And while we're commending the decision to maintain Māori and Pacific representation on the council, we are concerned, as you've heard, that these communities won't be given a strong enough voice on the council. We're already seeing the possible impact of the changes that this would bring. And as some of my previous colleagues have said, there's quite a lot of concern about in places like Palmerston North and Dunedin, where it's quite likely that organisations will receive no recurrent funding. And that will obviously be detrimental to those communities. And at the moment, the proposal tells us that there will be support available for 3 theatre companies only, one in Christchurch, Auckland and one in Wellington. And in fact, this presents problems even in Wellington, where currently 2 theatre companies receive recurrent funding. I want to refer to the concern that is starting to be manifested in my own city in Dunedin around this, and I'd like to read to you an excerpt from an editorial that was published in the Otago Daily Times on the 27th of July, which said that in the appendix on page 17 of Creative New Zealand's review of recurrently funded organisations, it is written in black and white, quote, "Support is available for at least 3 theatre companies to create and present high-quality New Zealand theatre, one in each of Christchurch, Auckland and Wellington," and on page 16 under the same limits on support column, in the orchestral music category, the report reads, "Support is available for at least 2 high-standard orchestras, in addition to the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, one in the North Island and one in the South Island." So there's small wonder that the cultural leaders in Dunedin and Otago are alarmed. In response to quite a lot of the coverage that this received in recent weeks, a visit was made to Dunedin last week by Creative New Zealand Chief Executive Stephen Wainwright. And Mr Wainwright and Creative New Zealand Arts Infrastructure Services Manager Jane Clark visited Dunedin to address the fears over the body's new funding regime. They visited the Fortune Theatre, the Southern Sinfonia and the Dunedin City Council, which was good. In an interview with the Otago Daily Times, it was reported that Mr Wainwright said facilities in Dunedin were remarkable for a city of its size. The Fortune and Sinfonia do a lot well in a very challenging environment, he said. Then he said, resources may or they may not change. We try not to do that in a way that will do harm to the arts community. Well, that sounds good so far, but then he said, it's only sensible to look again after 20 or 30 years and make sure that what you're doing is relevant. Communities in New Zealand have very different flavours. There are some places where turbocharged changes are happening. For example, one baby in two born in Auckland is a Pacific Islander now. We wouldn't be being responsible if we weren't planning for those sorts of changes. So that's all good. Then he said, Creative New Zealand's charter to provide excellence and accessibility remained an aspirational goal. Now that's a phrase I think we've heard before in this House a lot, and now we're hearing it from government agencies. And then he said, we're certainly very conscious that there are a lot of areas where people say we want to have our own stuff. But the local authorities also have an obligation for the cultural well-being of a community. People want to live in a colourful arts and culture community. We hope these thoughts will crystallise at the council table. Now, that's telling me, is that telling us that the council is going to be responsible for funding the arts in Dunedin? And that is a serious concern for the community of Dunedin and Otago, and also Southland, because those are important. The Fortune Theatre and the Southern Symphonia service the whole of that region. Mr. Speaker, this bill is, I guess you could call it classic think big National Party policy, where streamlining becomes action without consultation, which is why we want to see it through to the Select Committee, because we, as we've said, concerned that it will reduce representation and further centralise power in Wellington. And while I listened quite carefully to what the previous speaker, Nikki Kay, said about Auckland being the centre of the arts, well, there's a lot more to the artistic community in New Zealand than Auckland, and while Auckland is very important, the rest of New Zealand is important. Every community matters, and supporting the arts in every community matters, and that's what I would hope that this government would be doing, not just centralising funding around 2 or 3 centres. We could, and we could instead of having funding for communities, for artistic endeavours in communities throughout New Zealand, we could be left with a slow-moving, monolithic entity that serves, and I would hate to see this, and I would hate to think it, but a select cadre of the minister's friends, and less about advancing Kiwi creativity throughout all communities. So Labor is concerned that the Arts Council is no longer required to prepare and publish after public consultation a strategic plan every 3 years, and is required to prepare a statement of intent. It hints that the strategy will come from the Minister's office and will therefore be very top-down, and I don't know what other conclusions you can draw from that. And the problem with this legislation is that it doesn't provide any forward thinking. There's no mention in the bill of project-based funding in infrastructure and capital. We're also concerned that the Arts Council will now be charged with the rights of artists and may end up portraying an elitist view and not considering community artists, classic national government tactics. And this government needs to look at whether other ministers and ministries should be consulted when appointing the council members, and in addition, local government New Zealand should also be consulted with appointments. We'd like to see a clause in the legislation to review the council in 5 years' time so that there is an assurance that every community and voluntary sector will not be excluded, and it's our expectation that the Select Committee will address these and other concerns.